It all started with a restlessness that didn't fit with the simple life I was leading. I could walk through the mechanical village with my eyes closed, smell the sea air from my bed, and detect the presence of a white heron, just by the rustle of its wings cutting through the morning fog. I knew every creak in my old cabin just as well as I knew the tools in the workshop, but lately I'd started to notice a different kind of silence. It was made of small absences, of doors gently closing, and footsteps dragging down the hall. My name is Samuel Harris, and if you were to ask the people here, they'd say I'm a practical guy, head down, hands calloused from fixing boats and engines. Ever since the divorce, I've preferred the sound of my own thoughts to the buzz of other people. I turned my routine into my sanctuary, and small tasks into my safe harbor. Maybe that's why, when Oliver started to retreat even more into his room, shutting himself off from conversations and meals, I just chalked it up to another phase of adolescence. He was already over 16, not a child, and my own parents were never much for asking questions. I thought, it'll pass, it's just a phase, like so many others. But that distance had something about it that bothered me in an almost physical way. The strange thing is, there was no fight, no shouting. In fact, it was precisely this politeness, this excess of education every time I tried to start a conversation, that became a wall. We were two neighbors living under the same roof, united by the same last name, but with different countries in our heads. Oliver was always reserved. I always saw more gestures from him than words, but there was a lightness that now seemed to have evaporated from his face. Short, evasive smiles, sunken eyes, and an almost exaggerated care not to bother anyone. In silence, I walked inside this emptiness, fumbling for what I could do to cross that distance. My routine has always been to build and restore. Over the days, I bring worn-out engines back to life, make wood useful again, and restore boats that everyone had given up for lost. Turning the old into new is something that has always brought me peace, as if every screw put back in place was also a piece of who I once was. The smell of rust mixed with salt, the skin always a little dry, the satisfaction of washing my hands at the end of the day, knowing I'd made something useful again. This was the life I wanted to pass on to my son, a sequence of small joys that together form a mosaic of purpose and meaning. On cold mornings, Oliver would cross the hallway already on his phone, backpack hanging on one shoulder, lunch wrapped in aluminum foil. He almost always turned down breakfast. The sound of the door closing behind him was a harsh reminder that another day was starting without conversation, without sharing. I wasn't one for easy words, but I'd try one or two awkward invitations, which usually ran into monosyllabic answers. I missed the questions he used to ask when he was little, about how things worked, what was beyond the sea, where the winter seagulls went. Now, all that was left was the constant hum of his computer on in his room, muffled music, distant voices, worlds I didn't have access to. After hours of work in the workshop, I'd come home, and once again, the absence of sound would hit me. I knew he was there, locked in his room, and I never wanted to invade his space. Nobody wants to be the dad who goes through his son's drawers, but I started to notice his tired eyes, as if he wasn't sleeping properly, and a desire to disappear, mixed with another one to be seen, but unable to ask for help. It felt like there was no air between us, as if the ceiling was too low for two such different generations. I started to avoid any sudden movements, walked on tiptoes, and turned down the TV volume, as if I could avoid the discomfort I felt every time I faced entire nights listening only to the clock ticking and whispers coming from the other room. Deep down, I started to fear that maybe I was part of this silence, that maybe I had failed to notice something important in time. Out of pride or fear, I never asked him directly what was going on. There's an unwritten rule between parents and children, a kind of proud trap. If the other person doesn't speak, you pretend not to notice. But even among broken engines, too much silence is a sign of a breakdown. One Saturday afternoon, after spending hours trying to fix a jammed rudder, I came back to the house feeling a strange weight in my chest. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and bumped into a dirty plate, a leftover sandwich, a sneaker thrown by the door. Signs that my son still existed, still occupied that space, even if only physically. I looked at the closed door of his room and, for a moment, I wanted to knock. But letting everyone have their silence was all I had learned in life, so I hoped that one day it would resolve itself. The pattern, however, only broke a few days later, almost by accident. I was looking for an old recipe on the computer, a cake I'd promised to make, but I could never remember where I'd saved the steps. The system redirected me to Oliver's account since the computer was old and shared. It was there that I saw the icon of a social network flashing in the browser, different from the ones I used. I clicked without thinking, with a lot of fatherly curiosity, maybe just curiosity about my son's world. It looked like a familiar site, one of those video platforms that took the place of TV. But the channel name immediately caught my attention. Nexus Talks. I started scrolling the mouse across the screen, seeing an endless list of videos, all with thumbnails that only showed landscapes, phrases, and neutral images. I only connected the dots when I saw that the muffled voice in the videos was my son's, and his way of speaking revealed facets that were totally new to me. He shared vulnerabilities, insecurities, childhood episodes, and above all, narrated feelings from a world that I almost never cared to see. Oliver's words echoed in my head like a cracked bell. Without ever showing his face, he shared with thousands of people what he had never told me. He was gay, and he feared disappointing his father more than anything else. There was no grand confession, no drama. It was all narrated with a sensitivity that broke what little defense I still used, with phrases like, "Some days my house feels too small, not because of its size, but because of the accumulated silences. There are some things we don't say because we're afraid of losing the little that's left." As I listened, my whole body tingled. I didn't know whether to close the laptop, cry, or look for answers somewhere. A part of me felt like an intruder, as if I had opened a gift that wasn't for me. Another, deeper part, just regretted the fact that I had to find out something so crucial about my own son's life that way. Maybe my mistake was waiting too long, thinking that everyone should win their battles alone, when in fact, not every war needs a single soldier. I stayed there for hours watching old videos. I listened about the fears of growing up, insecurities about his own body, the absence of role models, and most of all, the terror of being rejected. There was my son, opening his heart to the world and closing it to me. With every sentence, I got further away from the practical Samuel who fixed engines and realized how hard it was to fix the silence inside the house. That night, I knocked on his bedroom door, but didn't say a word. Inside, I knew that any rash action would only bring more distance. The next day, I opened the workshop very early. I let the accumulated tasks absorb me, but I could still hear Oliver's words as background noise. This wasn't just about being gay. It wasn't just a revelation. It was about a son who had needed to create an alternative universe to be heard, because his own home no longer allowed him to speak. I was overcome with an almost physical guilt, a desire to turn back time and erase all the moments I had chosen silence as a response. I only really got moving when Oliver's laptop was left open in the living room, and I saw that he had responded to a subscriber's comment with such careful words that it seemed like he was advising himself. Until then, I was afraid that any initiative of mine would stumble into the territory of invasion. But at that moment, it occurred to me that there was an urgency in me, not to ask, but to offer him something of himself, even if it was just a thread of support. Anonymously, I created a profile just to send a message that said something like, "There is a lot of love in the intervals of silence, even if you can't see it yet." I didn't sign it, didn't reveal anything. I just wanted, at least once, to give him the comfort that, out of cowardice, I had never been able to give him in the flesh. I spent the rest of the week waiting for a sign, any sign. Meals continued to be silent, but I noticed that Oliver had a twinkle in his eyes when he looked at the screen. I wondered if, somehow, that message had crossed the sea of anonymity and calmed some pain that I myself had helped build. As the days passed, I started to notice small changes in our routine. They weren't grand gestures, but subtle signs. Oliver would look at me for a few extra seconds, as if he was looking for something new. Sometimes he'd want to comment on a funny video or a curious piece of news. Other times he'd ask questions about the family's past, the kind of curiosity he'd never shown before. One night, as we were having dinner, he asked if I'd seen any interesting channels on the internet lately. I choked, but chose to smile and say that the digital world was too big for my simple mechanic's mind. Even so, I started to notice that a silent invitation was in the air. Oliver seemed more and more willing to comment on channel topics in front of me, albeit in a veiled way, as if testing the waters. Sunday lunches, which used to be solitary, became the setting for somewhat disconnected conversations about topics that orbited his universe: books, TV shows, youth dilemmas, without ever really mentioning the central reason. I remember one morning when the cold came in without knocking, and I noticed the light in his room was on. I walked down the hall and heard snippets of a recording, a kind of failed rehearsal, where he repeated the introduction to a new video over and over. There was insecurity and hesitation in his voice. It was strange. My son, who won over thousands of listeners, was stumbling as he rehearsed the first words for a more personal video. I was tempted to knock on the door, to ask if everything was okay, but I preferred to respect his timing, in the same way I would want mine to be respected. The workshop, in turn, continued to function as my refuge. It was there that I best deciphered my own contradictions. While my clients commented on the coming cold or the price of fuel, my mind began to compare every jammed engine with what was happening inside my house. It was in this setting of solder, rust, and oil that I began to think of ways to reconnect with the son I had learned to admire from a distance. The real turning point happened the following Sunday. It's a tradition here. Every second Sunday of the month there's a swap meet in the village. A simple event, but one that always brought back memories of other times. Of those when Oliver used to stand by my side asking to play with the tools, and I'd turn away, afraid he'd get hurt. I invited him to go, without expecting a yes. To my surprise, he accepted, even without hiding his disinterest. We walked together, side by side, like two strangers forced into coexistence. However, I noticed that he no longer avoided my presence. At certain moments, he even sought my gaze, as if looking for approval before saying something about an old record or a curious object. At the end of the fair, we stopped in front of a used bookstall. Oliver picked up a copy worn by time, Letters to a Young Poet, and stood there, flipping through it, while I pretended to be interested in a car part. That's when, out of nowhere, he said, "Did you know that sometimes writing to strangers is easier than talking to the people you live with?" That sentence hit me hard. I agreed with a gesture, and inside every word of his untied an old knot. On the way home, I brought up the topic of the channel, but in the most indirect way possible. I talked about how much I admired people who could express feelings on the internet, without caring about criticism or judgment. I peered into the rearview mirror and saw a shy smile appear on his face. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me hope. The following days brought a lighter routine. We started doing small things together, preparing dinner, tidying up the bookshelf, watching an old movie on TV. The conversations were still hesitant, but we clearly wanted to get closer. I felt that, slowly, the boy who hid behind screens and anonymous comments was finally trying to show me who he was. However, it's never simple to change old habits. Despite the progress, there were barriers deeper than any overnight conversation could break down. Oliver still sometimes needed to lock himself in his room, maybe to organize his ideas, maybe to escape the weight of expectations. I, in turn, blamed myself for every misinterpreted gesture, every poorly timed silence. All this reconstruction happened at the pace of small daily activities. Dinner became a kind of ritual. We learned recipes together, each of us in charge of a part, laughing at our mistakes, sharing tasks without demands. Even the garbage, a chore neither of us liked, took on new meaning, as it was in those few minutes of walking to the street that we risked conversations about the week or a viral video. I realized that to break the true distance, courage would be needed. I learned, little by little, that a father's love is not just about offering food or a roof, but about offering a listening ear, making space for the other to be who they are. Sometimes, a gesture of affection is worth more than many questions. I started to be more truly present, without demands, willing to build a trust that only transparency can establish. The internet, which had previously seemed like a chasm between us, became a bridge. Oliver would suggest we watch videos he liked together, and slowly, during these moments, I realized that laughter came naturally, and differing opinions didn't turn into arguments, but opportunities for learning. At some point in these very new coexistences, I stopped seeing my son as a stranger. I began to see in him the boy from before, but much stronger, more capable of existing in his fullness than I had ever been. This doesn't mean everything became easier. Bloom, our mutt, was the one who noticed the change the most. Before, he avoided Oliver's room, but now he would lie at the door waiting for him to come out. At our dinners, the songs chosen were happier, and the old kitchen radio seemed less out of tune. I discovered that family isn't something you build from the top down, but from the inside out, brick by brick, gesture by gesture. Finally, I dove deep into memories of how I grew up, the silences I inherited from my own father, how much it cost me to unlearn demanding from others what I didn't even know how to give. I made a commitment to myself not to repeat that cycle anymore, even if it meant trying every day. Because deep down, all I wanted was to see my son happy with himself, without fear, without reservations. And so, in the mix of day-to-day reconstruction, small invitations, conversations that cut across, and shy signs of getting closer, we went about restitching a relationship that, for a long time, seemed to me irremediably lost. But that, with patience and courage, was finally showing signs of new life. It was already spring on the calendar, but the night still brought that cold that insisted on getting into your bones, especially in the village where everything seemed to take longer to warm up. I was in the kitchen, distracted, chopping vegetables for a soup that Oliver had suggested, when I heard the light sound of his bedroom door opening. He came in, his steps soft, looking sideways at where I was. He didn't say anything immediately, just set the table, as if that gesture were common there. But we both knew it wasn't. "I think a soup like this could blow up on my channel," he joked, with an awkward smile, trying to lighten the heavy air. I nodded, a half-smile escaping as well, and let slip that if he was going to teach the internet, the least he could do was show me the recipe firsthand. We sat across from each other, sharing the warmth of the steaming bowl. The conversation would get stuck, then get going in spirals of random topics. A funny story from school, a comment about work in the workshop, an inside joke with a neighbor's dog. The laughter there was authentic, not forced, and for the first time in months, I forgot the feeling of having lost my son to a digital universe. Out of nowhere, Oliver held my gaze for a few moments, without looking away, and I saw a shine there that mixed courage and fear. He said suddenly that he was planning to record a different video, to show his face for the first time, but he wasn't sure how the audience would react. And more than anything, he didn't know how I would feel seeing everyone get to know that side of him before me. This was the turning point between us. I put down my spoon, took a deep breath, and, in a very un-me impulse, reached my hand across the table until I touched his. It was a simple, almost shy gesture, but loaded with meaning. Our fingers met, and right there, without needing any big speeches, I felt a spark of mutual understanding. It was as if, finally, we could hear what the other had wanted to say for so many years, but for which neither of us could find a voice. We went to the living room, more intimate than ever, not because of words spoken, but because of the willingness to listen to each other's silence. Oliver turned on the laptop and, trembling, played an unreleased video. It was a recording of him trying to rehearse how he was going to introduce himself, stumbling over some sentences, laughing nervously, making mistakes, starting over. I sat next to him on the couch. The room seemed smaller, as if the glow of the screen enveloped us in a bubble made only of courage and vulnerability. The smell of soup still floated in the air, but it was no longer enough to warm us. It was the warmth of our skin, of our held breaths, and of the touch, first on our hands, then on my shoulder, in the way I went about comforting every bit of nervousness he let out. It seemed like every breath was rehearsed, every movement expected, but they all happened with a naturalness that bordered on instinct. I leaned my head on his, without ceremony, like someone who rests their face on their own child to protect them from the world, but this time, also to protect him from the fear of being who he is. The flirtation between us, and here I'm talking about affection, presence, the touch that rebuilds space, was strengthened by tiny gestures. A nervous laugh, a shoulder bumping into the other, legs touching under the blanket that shared warmth in the middle of the couch. There was a new magnetism between us, something delicate and deep, that wasn't physical, but transcended the lost time, as if we could both, finally, recognize ourselves in each other's skin. The atmosphere thickened in a way we had never experienced. The sound of the rain outside, because in that village, spring insists on showing up between storms and drizzles, reinforced the feeling of shelter. I stayed there, attentive to every sigh, and I noticed that Oliver stopped looking at the screen. His eyes were only looking for mine, wanting to hear from me the permission to exist without masks. He rested his head on my shoulder. I couldn't resist. I put my arm around him, squeezing lightly, feeling the accelerated pulse of both of us. It was a comfortable silence, a kind of coziness that, for years, I had denied myself from experiencing. We breathed together, each protecting the other's fragility, as if that hug were the only shell capable of containing all the storm that was around us. At that moment, the TV, which was on by chance, showed random scenes. The sparse laughter in the background became a soft soundtrack for a conversation that finally became intimate. For the first time in a long time, I cried. Not out of sadness, but out of relief and pride. Oliver wasn't surprised. He just held my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine tightly. We spoke little, But everything that needed to be said was in that embrace. No identity or choice should push away those who love you. The night went on with low confidences, small secrets whispered, and touches that restored the feeling of belonging. The whole time I realized how much our complicity was made of almost invisible details. A shared blanket, shared coffee, the certainty that now there was nothing left to hide. In that new microcosm, we created an intimate bubble, where every look had weight and every smile contained promises of a fresh start. It wasn't just phrases said, it was a gesture, it was skin, it was shared truth. I felt that we were becoming a family again, not out of imposition or role, but because we finally allowed ourselves to occupy the same space in the most authentic way possible. Time seemed suspended that night. We slept together on the couch, without rush, without the need for distance. The dreams didn't matter, if we were there, a safe universe for each other. When I woke up, it was already day, but I tried to pretend that time hadn't passed. Oliver was still breathing peacefully, hugging my arm, and I realized that that feeling of protection was now reciprocal. We were no longer father and son just by fate, but because we chose, together, to reinvent our bond in every small gesture. In silence, I was grateful for the courage he had to show himself to me, and I wondered how many parents are living in search of this type of reconnection in their own homes, without ever finding the courage to cross the trenches of pride or fear. As the days went by, that night unfolded in unexpected ways. We no longer felt the need to run from delicate topics, nor to hide behind the cold routines of daily life. The atmosphere in the house changed. A lightness took over the air. Conversations flowed more freely, and even Bloom, our dog, seemed to sense that something had changed for the better. The next step came naturally. Oliver kept up his recording routine, but now, every once in a while, he would invite me to share the couch while he edited videos. I accepted. Even without really understanding that universe of cameras, microphones, and lights, I felt an absurd pride seeing his courage in turning vulnerability into a message. Sometimes, I was just an audience. In others, I would help choose the songs or even suggest changes to the scripts, even though I knew he would correct everything later, gently, so as not to hurt my enormous pride. On one of those nights, he told me that he was thinking of recording a special live stream, with my participation, to show that you don't overcome prejudice alone. I confess I hesitated. Exposure has never been, nor will it ever be my thing, but I understood the meaning of that request. It wasn't just about him revealing his face to the world. It was about showing that, above all differences, there was now a real openness to support each other. I accepted the invitation, my heart beating fast in my chest. In the days leading up to the event, I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about the right phrases, advice, stories from the past. But the more I rehearsed mentally, the more I realized that the strength of our moment was precisely in the improvisation, in the truth of every word, no matter how crooked or shy it was. When the livestream night arrived, Oliver was a mix of anxiety and excitement. He arranged the scene in the room, placed 2 glasses of water on the table, and positioned the camera. I sat next to him, a little clumsy, feeling the sweat running down my back, even though it was cold outside. The broadcast began, and in a few minutes, hundreds of people connected. Oliver introduced himself, showed his face, and, finally, talked about his journey, fears, anxieties, lessons, and the challenge of being who he is at home. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath, held his hand under the table, and let my accent and shyness show. "If there's one thing I've learned from all this," I said, my voice choked, "it's that love isn't imposed, it's learned, and we should be proud of courage, not silence." Messages popped up, little hearts flew up the screen, and I saw tears in Oliver's eyes. The chat itself filled with people telling their experiences, saying that our moment had given courage to many. For a moment, I felt that my life, so out of the spotlight, had suddenly served to light up other homes. The repercussions were immediate. We received messages from distant relatives, people from the village, young people from all over. Some congratulated us, others were moved. Many asked if they could get inspiration. It was then that I realized our gesture, which seemed small and restricted to the kitchen at home, had finally echoed throughout the world. The next day, Oliver was exhausted, but radiant, like someone who has a huge weight lifted off their shoulders. The relationship between us became even stronger. Now, we even shared each other's pride. Shame gave way to respect. Our conversations now had a different center, no longer who we were, but who we could be from then on. The transformation didn't just happen in the big gestures, but in the details of the routine. He started leaving his room more often, sought my company for a walk, and, sometimes, called me to help with new video ideas. Meals regained that joy of people who recognize each other at the table. Whenever possible, we would exchange late-night confidences, sharing dreams and fears, without needing to hide anything anymore. It was in this context of reconstruction that Oliver showed me a special letter he had received. Initially, I thought it was from a fan or admirer, but the envelope had an unexpected signature: Clifford Harris, my father, who had been absent for 2 decades. I read and reread that piece of paper, feeling my breath catch in my chest. In the letter, he said he had seen the live stream. He talked about the regret of never having been able to be close to me, of having let fear and pride speak louder back in his own time. The handwriting was shaky, the words simple, but the message was clear. He wanted a new beginning, with his grandson, with me, with the time that was left. That surprised me on a level that no words had been able to for a long time. I thought a lot about how cycles repeat themselves when we don't have the courage to act differently, to listen to the other person. I told Oliver about his grandfather's message. He was speechless, but in his eyes, a renewed hope shone. The hope that not only our home, but the family could finally be rebuilt. In the following days, we agreed to respond together, inviting Clifford to visit us, to better understand who we were now. Oliver lovingly prepared a playlist of the channel's best videos as a way of introducing his own world to his grandfather. More than ever, I realized that there was something bigger at play. The real chance to break the cycle of absences, of interrupted phrases, of postponed hugs. The internet, once a symbol of distance, was now a bridge to the past and the future. When I saw Oliver's emotion in front of the letter, I felt that, in that gesture, it wasn't just him who was getting a fresh start, but all of us. The strength of truth spoken, of shared intimacy, of respect earned in the details, became the guiding thread of a relationship that, one day, was almost lost to the fear of speaking. I finally realized that it wasn't just my son's courage that moved our family, but the willingness to listen, to make space for everyone to exist, with all their colors, all their pains and all their joys, without fear, without censorship. The silence now had turned into memories, and the memories finally could be told without shame or rush. There, in the warmth of that new routine, I learned, along with Oliver, that it's never too late to start over, and that every secret, when embraced with truth, is the seed of the most authentic freedom. Receiving that letter from my father was like opening a door that I had kept locked for so long that I almost didn't believe it existed anymore. Clifford Harris was more of a memory than a presence. I grew up in the shadow of his silence. We never argued. We were never intimate either. Words about feelings were so rare that they became precious stones. As a child, I waited for the day I would hear something deeper than formulas of etiquette or dry, practical advice. But time passed, and with it came the walls, the distance, life pushing me away from that man who was so rigid, so sure of himself and his rules. The last time I saw Clifford was before I moved here, already decided that, if I was going to make mistakes, at least it would be in my own way. I never imagined that his absence would also become a pattern, echoing in me and, unintentionally, spilling over into the way I raised Oliver. I accepted that pain as part of the price of trying to be a better person, a more open person. But it took me a long time to realize that I repeated attitudes that hurt me so much. Seeing this whole cycle exposed, stitched together in simple phrases on a piece of paper, mixing an apology with a thirst for a fresh start, moved me too much. It took me a while to process. I showed the letter to Oliver without filters, without ceremonies. He scanned each line with a mix of suspicion and surprise, and then kept turning the envelope between his hands, lost in thoughts I could only guess at. I sat next to him, listening to the soft creak of the couch, and said, "You know, son, sometimes time makes us think things can never change again, but I think it also serves to show that there's always a window to try again." He smiled, with that calm way he always uses when he's absorbing something bigger. "Do you think it's worth reopening the door for him, Dad?" I thought for a moment, and answered with the raw honesty we had come to exercise together. "I honestly don't know, but I think it's worth showing him what I myself still need to learn." Oliver nodded, his eyes attentive. "If we don't try, will it keep hurting?" "I think so, yes." We decided together to write back to Clifford, inviting him to visit us. This time, without masks, without theatrics, just with a sincere desire to build something true, even if it started crooked, insecure, and clumsy. I sent the response without formalities, signing it with what life had taught me. Come when you feel it in your heart. We are open to starting over, without demands, without real expectations. Just come. The following days were filled with anxiety, but not the paralyzing kind. It was a mix of curiosity, hope, and that butterflies in your stomach feeling of cheating on the past and surprising the future. Oliver spent his afternoons recording, reviewing old videos, choosing clips to show his grandfather if he showed up. I was tidying up the house without realizing it, throwing away what was no longer needed, rummaging through those boxes I had kept for years under the excuse of, I'll get to this someday, as if I could prepare the home not just to receive the other person, but to fit a whole new story there. When Clifford responded, scheduling to visit us, nervousness took over the house. Oliver laughed at my rehearsals of phrases to say to his grandfather, and I made fun of the excess of questions he wanted to write down. Bloom, our dog, felt the atmosphere and spent the day glued to our legs, as if he sensed that something important was about to happen. On the agreed-upon day, that typical mix of important family reunions came. The table set with more care, instrumental music on the radio, the window wide open to let in all the air possible. Clifford arrived wearing the same old hat as always. He came in stepping slowly, shaking raindrops from the bottom of his pants, and with an old weariness in his eyes, but also a new luminous shine that surprised me. I stood still for a second, trying to gather the courage to say anything. He looked at Oliver with those clear eyes of someone who is facing a rear-view mirror of their own blood. "Are you the boy from the videos?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Oliver smiled, hesitant, but answered in his way, direct and open. "Yes, I am. And you're my grandfather, right?" The three of us laughed at that intersection of nervousness and grace. The ice broke and continued to melt in the following conversation, in comments about the village, in awkward hugs, in strange memories giving way to new first impressions. In the hours that followed, something rare happened. I felt there was no rush or filter. Clifford told, in his own way, about the mistakes he had made, the frustrated attempt to be too strong, and how much he regretted the time wasted between pride and fear. He apologized, but without making a spectacle of it, just acknowledging his own past to make space for the future. Oliver, in turn, explained the reason for the channel, what the process of accepting himself was like, the pain of not being understood, and, most importantly, the desire to interrupt cycles of silence. We talked about everything: childhood, music, the internet, prejudice. Each story acted as a key opening doors in all directions, from the head to the heart, from the past to the present, from fear to hope. At night, we had a barbecue in the backyard, the kind of messy one that brings together grilling food and people sharing stories under the stars. Clifford risked a toast, to the wrongdoers who return, to the young people who teach, and to the courage to change. We clinked our glasses, Oliver smiled at me. I felt like crying and laughing at the same time. There, 3 fractured generations met at the table, and the sound of our voices was finally greater than the silence. From that day on, nothing went back to being the same. Clifford started to visit more often. At first he was shy, then more present. He became a living part of the house. The differences were screaming: tastes, beliefs, habits, ideas. But the attempts, especially the attempts, were daily. Even when one of us stumbled over some old resentment or an unnegotiable difference, there was always a new conversation, a new reason to bring the other person closer. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped being a prison and became a lesson. Over time, we planned a video together for Nexus Talks, a special episode with 3 generations: me, Oliver, and Clifford. The theme was legacy, family, and the importance of listening. We wrote the questions together, each bringing their own vulnerability, and we recorded sitting on a wooden bench in the backyard, at sunset. The images were very beautiful, but nothing compared to the power of what happened away from the cameras. In the video, each of us talked about a regret, a fear, a desire for a fresh start. Clifford talked about the pride disguised as strength that prevented him from getting close to his own son. I narrated how the fear of making a mistake made me prefer silence over trying. Oliver confessed the relief of being heard, and the hope that after this, maybe, no one else needs to hide so much just to be accepted. As strange as it may seem, that recording was neither the end nor the beginning of anything, but simply another stage in the reconstruction of who we were. After it was published, the repercussions went beyond anything we expected. Strangers wrote accounts of reconciliations. People from the village came to congratulate us on our courage. Others stopped by my workshop just to say that they had started talking better with their own children or parents after seeing our conversations. In that flow of stories, I discovered that every secret is only devastating as long as it doesn't find a listening ear. Once it's embraced, it becomes an antidote, a bridge, an open flower where before there was only stone. It was strange to think about how all of this had started in the worst way. A cold silence, the fear of looking at the wound, the suspicion that exposing feelings would mean losing authority or respect. I discovered the opposite. Sharing vulnerabilities made us stronger, closer, and more human. Oliver's channel grew even more, not just in numbers, but in the type of comments. Young people said they had gained the courage to talk at home. Parents reported trying more sincere conversations. Clifford, now old, learned how to use his phone just to follow along live, and every now and then would respond to followers' comments, signing as the grandfather who came back. The impact of that new routine transformed me into a different man, less rigid, more curious, more willing to try different paths. I started to value every small moment, the slightly burnt cakes from the kitchen, the long nights on the couch, the shared coffees, even the silences, which were now much more cozy. The fear of exposure was dispelled by the gratitude of having found the chance to rewrite my story with my son, and of not leaving for tomorrow the conversations and affections that always deserved to have been lived today. And it was in this vein of daily construction that I allowed myself to look at the past without shame, at the future without anxiety, and at the present with vigor. I felt, with Oliver and Clifford, that family is, in fact, a place you choose. You choose to listen, to embrace, to try again, as many times as necessary. I discovered that apologizing doesn't diminish anyone, and that every reconciliation walks alongside forgiveness, even when it takes a long time to happen. Oliver, increasingly confident, became a reference for many young people in the city and outside it. Our last name, once marked by absences, was now synonymous with a fresh start. I, in turn, learned that it's not enough to love. You have to show it, talk about it, listen, and above all, stay. Clifford, with his white hair and trembling hands, surprised everyone by growing with us. If I could summarize what came out of all this, I would say, to love is to be willing to rewrite your own truth. It's to embrace the stranger in the other, and also in yourself. It's to build bridges even over rivers that seem impassable. And above all, it's never to surrender to the idea that it's too late. Deep down, I understood that the true secret isn't in what you keep, but in what you share, and especially in what you listen to. When a family learns to listen to its own pains, it transforms trauma into strength, fear into hope. Now, every morning, I look at the house and I see a photograph. 3 generations sitting side by side, smiling at a camera, each one healing the other's past, just with the courage to say, I see you, I hear you, I accept you. The home, finally, is that space where even silence speaks of love. So, if this story touched you, remember that it's always worth it to try again. Send that message, start that conversation, take a step in the direction of someone who matters, even if it seems strange or awkward. Leave your comment telling us what has changed in your life or what you want to change. Like, share with whoever needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel to follow our story. Because believe me, there's always space for fresh starts. And as long as there is love and a willingness to listen, there will always be hope. Until the next chapter.